Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Benuli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith, author, leading global finance blogger, and as we call him, America's philosopher. He's the author of 9 books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, A Model for Positive Change, and The Nearly Free University in the Emerging Economy. His blog of twominds.com has logged over 55 million page views, well more now, and is number 7 on CNBC's top alternative finance sites. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
Great. And we thought we'd focus today on actually your new book, Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic. This book is a great book that actually addresses what's happening now in terms of the dysfunction in government, what we see happening in the news media, the polarization of the public in the Western world, what lays in stores for us. Would you like to give us initially a synopsis of the book?
Okay, thank you, Richard. I think what I'm trying to address here in this book is that we're entering an era of what I call nonlinear change. And in other words, as opposed to the linear change, which is rather steady, slow, and kind of predictable. So incremental adjustments are all that's needed to get through linear change eras. But as you enter a nonlinear change era, then it's more like what happened in the global economy in 2008, 2009. Systems start failing on a very large scale, and they fail very quickly. And there's a lot of chaotic turmoil in this nonlinear change eras. And so I'm drawing upon the work of a bunch of different historians and analysts, one of which we've discussed in the past, Peter Turchin, who presents a very strong case as to why we're entering a period of rising discord and disintegration of systems and kind of unifying narratives. So I guess the idea of my book was to discuss this, the difficulties in getting through a nonlinear change era, and also to present some strategies that would be the more successful strategies to get through that and actually come out ahead, if you will. In other words, having gained or prospered despite these challenges that are unprecedented.
Mm-hmm. And so initially you point out what we have now is twin cancers that threaten our democracy, namely the idea of the government now captive to special interests and big money. Can you elaborate?
Okay, right. One of the key dynamics that I'm trying to discuss in the book is how centralization has entered sort of what we call an S curve, where it worked really well over the last, say, 400 years, in which you could leverage problem solving by centralizing power and wealth, right? And so that was sort of the whole imperial project that Britain and the colonial powers followed. So, but now we're at the point where centralization is actually causing more problems than it's solving, and it's at the top of the S curve, and it's in the decline phase. And so, one of the core problems with centralization is once you centralize political power, then it's much easier for wealth or powerful individuals to capture control of the government, because you really only have to influence, a few dozen people, really. And then you've captured this enormous concentration of power, and that's partly what we see in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in other national capitals, that very wealthy corporations and financiers have an outsized control over the mechanisms of governance. And as studies have shown, the bottom 99.9% really don't have much of a say anymore in what their government decides to do or its policies that it pursues. And I would also argue that centralization of financial wealth and power has also made the system much more vulnerable to disruption. And just as a quick example, if you only have 5 money center banks and they control, the vast majority of financial instruments and mortgages and so on, then any kind of crisis that affects them quickly spreads throughout the entire system, which is exactly what happened in 2008, 2009. Whereas if you had a system with 1,000 decentralized banks, each drawing upon its own local resources and only slightly connected to each other, then a crisis in one area that even involved up to 100 banks would not bring down the entire system. So my point here is centralization itself creates systemic vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm. And so this is basically characterized as a loss of confidence and trust in government institutions, if you will.
Right. There's two major dynamics that this distortions of the system created by extreme concentrations of wealth and power. There's two. One is the loss of trust or confidence in the institutions running society and the economy. The other one is tremendous wealth inequality, in that the top 0.1% or so has been, as this chart, which I label the fruits of financialization from the New York Times, the vast majority of the income and wealth that's been created in the last decade has flowed to the very top of the financial pyramid. And so that's creating a lot of discord in and of itself, right? Because it's difficult to have a stable society with widespread opportunity and social mobility and a social contract that people believe in when most of the gains are flowing to this tiny percentage of people at the top. And I have this other chart here, which is another kind of way of describing confidence and trust. And it's sort of a trust-based chart, which shows that competence, experience, and values combine to create trust. And I think the way I understand trust in this context we're describing, the people's confidence in their government, the people's confidence in their institutions. If that trust is part of the social contract, right? But it's also part of our social capital. In other words, societies that lack competence and experience and values that are expressed in the institutions, they're basically kleptocracies, right? Nobody trusts anybody. There's no rule of law, and it's run by an oligarchy. And so, of course, nobody has any faith or trust or confidence in the government, because the government doesn't really serve their interests, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, a lot of studies have shown that the United States, for sure, and arguably other Western nations too, have fallen into this basically trap of being ruled by oligarchies. And as a consequence, we've lost trust. Yeah.
Right. And then the overall crisis is being exacerbated by a toxic social media fueled tribalism, as you make the point, that has replaced what do you think with which side are you on?
Right. And we can discuss like how and why that's come about. But there's a sense that a lot of people have, people that tend not to be so ideological, that they see this as being exploited the powers that be. In other words, you can easily divide the populace into warring camps if you introduce all these divisive topics and promote them heavily in the mainstream media. So that's certainly not helping. Another key point of my book was I wanted to explore the idea that the core survival mechanism in any society or economy, is its adaptability. In other words, what do we learn from evolutionary principles, natural selection, and so on, which work not just in natural ecosystems, but in, human social systems. And so kind of in a broad brush, societies and economies that have the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions, that they're very flexible, they support experimentation and dissent, a diversity of ideas and solutions. This kind of foment, if you will, this kind of bubbling mixture of dynamic ideas and experimentation, this is what leads to success. You get a lot of failures, but you work through the failures quickly, and then the good ideas spread quickly. And this is basically evolution in a nutshell, right? Is that when species are put under stress by changing conditions, they generate a lot of experimentation, if you will, and then natural selection weeds out the good from the bad, and if it happens quick enough, the species can adapt by basically spreading these successful adaptations throughout the species. And so it really works the same for companies and communities and economies as a whole. And so when you have a highly centralized system that's captured by an oligarchy at the top, then that system is really static and sclerotic. It's the opposite of an adaptable system, because everybody that's benefiting, which is a handful of people at the top, they are going to resist any kind of change which might threaten their wealth and power. And so this is the sort of opposite of the system we want if we want to be able to adapt quickly.
And you have another chart that shows how what we really have is the illusion of incremental change. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this is a chart that I made up myself because I couldn't find any that really described what I think is a core dynamic of failing systems. Is failing systems, and you could use Venezuela, or you could use the United States, or there's a lot of examples out there that the status quo says we're gonna fix the problems by doing these little incremental steps. And it might be lowering interest rates a little bit, or injecting some liquidity, or taking a little more, raising the taxes to fund pensions, or these kinds of things. But if you're dealing with fundamental weaknesses or fundamental crises in the system, these kind of incremental changes simply don't work. They create an illusion that you're making progress, but they don't really get to the point of changing what's broken. And like, say, for instance, in the United States, what would have to change would be you'd have to change the political system so it was no longer serving an oligarchy. And that would mean making hugely radical changes in the structure of the system.
And so let's explore how that can be done in terms of solutions and migration strategy. So what do you suggest as being the solution? And then we can talk about how to get there for a migration strategy. So what do you see first on the solution exactly?
Well, that's a great question, Richard, and I really like your reference here of migration strategy, because, of course, very large systems and even our own lives rarely change like overnight, right? There might be a crisis that erupts overnight, but the process of adapting to that and creating solutions is obviously a multi-step process. I think the key that I'm suggesting in the book is, if we look at evolutionary principles the principles that support fast adaptation. And the Silicon Valley kind of cliche is fail fast, fail often, right? Because that's that idea of experimentation is you get that dynamism and you get to the success quickly if you are willing to take chances, if you're willing to entertain a lot of ideas and experiment, then the good ideas become visible, and then you can propagate those. So how do we create a system that does that? And the number one thing is to decentralize wealth and power, so that instead of having, like I said, 5 money center banks, you have hundreds of banks, and instead of one authority ruled by a small clique of people that say in the federal government that controls education policy and economic development and all these kinds of things, you'd instead decentralize that power so that each community had capital and power to pursue what works in that community or that region. And the internet is a tool that can be abused, but it can also be a tool for spreading innovations that work, right? So for local communities. So my basic proposal is, if you want to have an adaptable economy and society, you've got to radically decentralize the capital and power, or you're not going to have an adaptable system. You're going to have a system that's basically designed to fail once it's stressed by nonlinear crises.
Do you see the current movement coming out of France, the so-called yellow vests, les gilets jaunes, as they call it there? Do you see that as a manifestation of what's happening per the premise of your book?
Absolutely. And I think that when we talk about a migration strategy, I think the key dynamics I see is I see tremendous resistance from the oligarchy and the sort of ruling elites at the top, and we can see this in the French sort of elites' response to the Yellow Vest uprising, which is they've been completely tone deaf, right? They really don't understand this, and they're afraid because they are used to dealing with like a union that they can placate with a 20% raise, or some student leaders they can arrest, and then the whole thing falls apart. And so this kind of decentralized self-organizing movement of just loss of confidence in the government entirely, right? That's really what the Yellow Vests are saying is, we no longer trust you. We have zero confidence that you represent us or are even willing to represent us. And so how do you get, what happens in that kind of environment, which is to me fits this nonlinear idea that I'm promoting, which is these kinds of demonstrations or a public loss of confidence can explode like at a geometric rate, and it can happen extremely quickly. And it gives the society and the economy an opportunity for like a massive reset, right? And that reset has to be broad-based. It can't just be run by 12 elite guys from elite universities in some rooms, and they secretly create some policy. That's what's wrong with the system. That's not going to be a solution, right? So we might be able to get from a Yellow Vest type movement, we might actually make some progress if they can impose a decentralization of capital and power. Then you've got the setup for spreading broad-based opportunity, and really that's what people want, right? They want agency, and they want opportunity. And I have a chart here that a lot of people might dismiss as touchy-feely or psychological as opposed to structural, but it's called ikigai, which is a Japanese concept meaning the purpose of your life or the reason for being. And it is a Venn diagram in which it shows various concepts that overlap what you're good at, your passion, your mission, what the world needs, what you can be paid for. And so the point of this chart in the context we're describing is a lot of people are pursuing this sort of centralized model where there's a few winners of globalization and financialization and financial repression, right? And then those people are have agency and capital and have fulfilling work. And then the losers of globalization and financial repression, which may end up being the majority of the workforce, they're supposed to just kind of scrape by on universal basic income or something. Then, in other words, you're supposed to just kind of consume some sort of minimal amount to stay alive, and that's what your life is from now on. And I think that if that's what we consider a solution, we have completely failed, because everybody wants a purpose in life. They want to be able to contribute. They want to be able to get ahead, and they want opportunity that's broad-based, not just reserved for an elite at the top. And so this Ikigai chart is can be seen as a model for the kind of economy we really want if we want to say we're going to succeed in a broad-based way, as opposed to just succeeding and keeping the oligarchy at the top of the pyramid.
Given the rising tide of social and political disunity and dysfunction, is there any migration strategy to get there, or is the only way through crash and burn of the entire system?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like apocalyptic, but the crash and burn,
yeah,
the crash and burn is probably the quick way, because the alternative way, like meaningful change, would require the ruling elites to recognize that their kind of greedy embrace of the majority of wealth and power, that this is destructive, and that they're gonna consciously let go of that. And that's asking a lot of people, especially people who the ruling elites in most societies have lost touch with the common people. And as we were discussing with the yellow vest, the French elites are just really tone deaf. They don't get it because they don't have any experience in real life of the yellow vests. And so this is, I think, typical of ruling elites, is that they've sequestered themselves. They live in a little elitist bubble. They're flying in a private jet to Switzerland and so on. And so to ask them to give up power and wealth for the good of society, they already believe that they're acting in the best interest of society by clinging on to their wealth and power. So it's hard to see how we can migrate from a really asymmetric system to a more balanced system, other than through some sort of crisis. And of course, crisis is opportunity too, right?
Yes, exactly. And any final words on how you see this playing out and the time frame?
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard. And I would say that individually and in terms of our own assets and capital, we would want to seek out locations, countries, regions, cities, neighborhoods, communities where the economy and the society is more balanced, is more symmetrical, it's more decentralized, it's more a network of equals rather than a really rigid hierarchy. Because these rigid hierarchies are, of course, prone to failure for a lot of reasons. And so if we can get ourselves into a more survivable, more adaptable structure on a local scale, then I think we're individuals and households are going to be better placed to get through nonlinear change. And so that means we want to avoid the worst excesses of financial repression, which would be being in debt and having a large amount of our income devoted to debt service. We'd want to get away from being dependent on one employer. or a hierarchy in which we might be fired or let go or have our pension cut in half. So you want to withdraw your dependence on these highly centralized systems, which are really prone to failure. I think that's kind of the solution on the individual household level, and in terms of enterprises, then you want to, if you have a say in it, then you certainly want to decentralize your your management. You want to diversify your income streams and not be dependent on, say, a government contract or that kind of thing. So that's kind of the path I see forward, which is more on the individual, household, enterprise level, as opposed to expecting a highly centralized system to basically surrender all of its power.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's great insight and words of wisdom, able to connect all the dots on what's happening today and where we're going. The name of the book, Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic, by Charles Hugh Smith. Thank you very much, Charles, for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And if anybody wants to read the first couple chapters of the book for free, just go visit of2minds.com, and you can download the PDF and have a look at the beginning of the book.
Great. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.